Funny how the past only remembers you when you fail, Daniel Brooks said into the microphone, his voice smooth, practiced, cutting clean through the low hum of the reunion hall as the chandelier light reflected off polished glasses and curated smiles. And then his eyes found her, standing near the edge of the room like she didn't belong there anymore. Olivia Bennet. I think we can all agree she's the only one here who somehow went backwards. A ripple of laughter followed, not loud, not cruel on the surface, but sharp enough to settle into the skin as heads turned, some curious, some amused, others quietly relieved it wasn't them, and Olivia didn't move, didn't flinch, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of a glass she hadn't touched, her dress simple, understated, the kind people wore when they weren't trying to prove anything, or maybe when no one expected them to. And for a moment the room held her there like a photograph, frozen between who she used to be and what they had already decided she had become, and Daniel smiled wider, encouraged by the silence, by the audience, by the version of her he believed still existed. I mean, we all had dreams, right? Some of us built companies, some of us. He shrugged, letting the unfinished sentence do the work, the implication hanging heavier than words ever could. And someone near the bar let out a soft chuckle. Another whispered something behind a hand, and the woman beside Daniel, perfect hair, perfect posture, leaned closer to him as if sharing in the joke, as if Olivia were nothing more than a distant anecdote. And still Olivia said nothing, her gaze steady, not on Daniel, not on the crowd, but somewhere just beyond them, like she was listening to something they couldn't hear yet, something approaching, something inevitable, because humiliation, real humiliation, didn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it came dressed in politeness, wrapped in old memories, served under warm lights and familiar faces. And yet there was something off, something that didn't quite fit the story they were telling about her, because she wasn't shrinking, wasn't breaking, wasn't even pretending to defend herself. She simply stood there, composed, untouched, as if this moment had already ended for her before it even began. And outside, far beyond the glass walls of the venue, a low vibration started to hum against the night air, too distant to notice, too subtle to interrupt the laughter, but close enough to be felt, if anyone had been paying attention. But no one was, not yet, because all eyes were still on the woman they thought they understood, the woman they thought had lost, the woman they thought had nothing left to show. And Daniel lifted his glass again, ready to seal the moment, ready to own it completely. Unaware that the story he was telling was already slipping out of his control, there was a time when that same room would have sounded different to Olivia Bennet, when laughter like this would have felt warm instead of measured, when Daniel Brooks would have been standing beside her instead of across the room, turning her into a story. And for a brief second the memory flickered in her mind, not as pain but as something distant, like an old photograph left too long in the sun, faded at the edges but still recognizable if you looked closely enough. She remembered the small apartment with uneven floors where they first started, where she stayed up past midnight reviewing numbers while he sketched ideas that never quite added up until she made them make sense. She remembered the early mornings when coffee was their only luxury and belief was the only thing they could afford, and how he used to look at her then, not with amusement or dismissal, but with something close to dependence, as if her presence steadied him, as if she was part of the reason he believed he could become more. And for a while she was, quietly building, quietly fixing, quietly holding together the pieces no one else saw, until success arrived not all at once but gradually, in bigger meetings, better suits, new people who did not know the version of him that needed her. And somewhere along that rise, she became less essential, less visible, until one night under a different kind of light he had said it plainly, not cruelly, not loudly, just certain, that she no longer fit into the life he was creating, that she was slowing him down, that she should understand, because he was thinking about the future, and she had listened then the same way she was listening now, without interruption, without pleading, because something inside her had already begun to shift, something that did not argue or resist, but simply stepped back. And when she left, she did not take much, not the apartment, not the shared accounts, not even the version of herself that had once tried so hard to keep everything intact. She walked away with what could not be measured, her time, her clarity, her silence, And in the months that followed, there were no dramatic comebacks, no sudden transformations that anyone could point to, just small, consistent choices. Early mornings again, but this time alone, learning things no one expected her to learn, taking work that did not look impressive but felt steady, real, grounded. And slowly the world that once revolved around him became irrelevant, replaced by systems and routes and decisions that stretched far beyond anything that room could imagine. And yet none of them here knew that version of her. They only knew the space she used to occupy beside a man who no longer needed her. And so they filled in the blanks the only way they knew how, with assumptions, with quiet judgments disguised as sympathy, with laughter that made the story easier to accept, and Olivia let them, because correcting them would have required explaining, and explaining would have meant returning to a version of herself she had already outgrown. So instead she stood there, steady, composed, her gaze calm as the distant vibration outside grew slightly stronger, still unnoticed by most, still just a faint presence against the glass, but enough to mirror something deeper, something inevitable, because while Daniel was still speaking about who she used to be, Olivia had already become someone he would not recognize. The laughter did not end all at once. It thinned out slowly, like a conversation losing interest, but the weight of it stayed in the air long enough to press against Olivia Bennett's shoulders. And still she did not move, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, as if the moment had already passed through her without leaving a mark. And that was what unsettled it most, not her silence, but the absence of reaction that Daniel Brooks had expected to see, because humiliation only worked when it was received, when it landed, when it created something visible. But there was nothing to hold on to here, no flinch, no defense, no attempt to reclaim dignity in front of an audience that had already decided her role. And for a brief second, something in his expression shifted, barely noticeable, a flicker of confusion that he quickly covered with another smile. Another sip of his drink, as if doubling down would restore the rhythm he had just disrupted, while across the room, a few people began to look at Olivia differently, not with sympathy, but with curiosity, because there was something off about the way she carried the moment, too steady, too detached, like someone who was not being judged, but simply observed it happening. And the woman beside Daniel leaned in again, whispering something that made him chuckle, though this time the sound felt thinner, less certain, and near the glass wall, someone finally glanced outside, distracted not by anything obvious, but by a subtle shift in the night, a low vibration that did not belong to music or conversation, something mechanical, distant but approaching, and the reflection of the room shimmered slightly against the glass, lights bending just enough to catch attention without explanation, while inside, Daniel placed his glass down and stepped a little closer toward Olivia, closing the distance as if proximity alone could reassert control. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, almost conversational. "You could have done something with yourself." And a few nearby guests leaned in, sensing the continuation, the need for a conclusion that would make the moment feel complete. But Olivia did not meet his tone, did not step back or forward. She simply looked at him, finally, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made his words feel smaller than he intended, as if they no longer carried the weight they once did. And in that look was something he could not immediately name, something that did not belong to the version of her he remembered, because it was not asking for approval, not seeking validation, not even acknowledging the hierarchy he believed still existed between them. It was just there, self-contained, untouchable, and outside. The sound grew louder, no longer subtle, a distinct presence pressing against the edges of the moment, enough now that more heads began to turn, conversations pausing mid-sentence, eyes shifting toward the glass, as the night itself seemed to react. But Daniel had not noticed yet, his attention still fixed on reclaiming a narrative that was quietly slipping away, unaware that whatever was approaching was not interrupting his story. It was ending at the sound outside was no longer something that could be ignored. It pressed against the glass in a steady, growing rhythm, deep and mechanical. The kind of presence that did not ask for attention but took it anyway, and one by one conversations began to fall apart mid-sentence as heads turned toward the windows, drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by something closer to instinct. while inside the room the carefully maintained balance shifted, laughter fading into confusion, confidence thinning into hesitation, and Olivia Bennet felt it before she saw it. The exact moment when the energy changed, when the weight of the room no longer rested on her, but began to drift outward, pulled toward whatever was arriving. And she did not rush, did not turn. Immediately, she simply let the moment unfold at its own pace, the same way she had learned to do in the years after she left. When reacting too quickly often meant losing control, and near the glass someone finally stepped closer, pressing a hand lightly against the pane as if trying to confirm what their eyes were beginning to register, a shape descending through the darkness, lights cutting clean lines through the night sky, too precise, too deliberate to be mistaken for anything ordinary. And a murmur spread, quiet at first but building, questions overlapping, voices lowering as realization replaced speculation, while Daniel Brooks remained half-turned toward Olivia, caught between finishing what he started and acknowledging what was clearly interrupting it, his expression tightening just slightly as the sound deepened, filling the space in a way that made his earlier words feel distant, almost irrelevant, and the woman beside him glanced toward the window, her grip on his arm loosening as attention slipped away from the scene he had created, and still Olivia had not moved, her calm unbroken, her gaze steady. Because this was not a surprise to her, not really, it was a moment she had already stepped into long before tonight, built quietly through choices no one here had witnessed, decisions that did not require validation or announcement. And as the aircraft descended lower, its presence now undeniable, a sleek silhouette framed against the glow of the venue lights, the room collectively shifted again, no longer focused on the past being discussed, but on the reality unfolding just outside. And for the first time that evening, Olivia allowed her eyes to follow theirs, turning slightly toward the glass, not with urgency, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if confirming something already known. And in that small movement there was a difference, subtle but unmistakable, because she was no longer standing in the shadow of what had been said about her. She was standing at the edge of something that was about to be revealed, and Daniel saw it. Not the plane, not yet fully, but the shift in her, the absence of reaction he could no longer explain, and it unsettled him. More than the noise, more than the interruption, because whatever was happening outside did not feel like coincidence anymore. It felt connected, intentional, and for the first time since he raised his glass, he hesitated, just long enough for the room to move on without him, just long enough for control to slip through his fingers. Without a sound, the aircraft settled into place with a precision that felt almost unreal, its lights cutting across the dark like a statement no one in the room had prepared for. And now every conversation had stopped completely, replaced by a silence that carried a different kind of weight, one filled with calculation instead of judgment, as people tried to understand what they were looking at, because this was not a distant flyover or a coincidence passing by. This was a landing, intentional, controlled, close enough that the vibration could be felt beneath their feet, and someone near the window whispered something under their breath, not a joke this time, not a comment meant to entertain, but a question, quiet and uncertain, while others stepped closer, drawn toward the glass as if proximity might offer clarity. And behind them Daniel Brooks finally turned fully, his attention pulled away despite himself, his earlier confidence no longer holding the same shape, as his eyes tracked the aircraft coming to a complete stop beyond the edge of the venue, its presence undeniable now, too specific to ignore, too precise to dismiss. And beside him the woman who had been holding onto his arm slowly let go without noticing, her focus entirely redirected, because whatever this was, it did not belong to the version of the night he had been controlling. And still Olivia Bennet remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if this moment had been accounted for long before anyone else recognized it. And in her stillness, there was something that did not match the unfolding confusion around her, not surprise, not curiosity, but quiet alignment, as though the outside world and her internal one had just met at the exact same point in time. And then the door of the aircraft opened, a small movement from this distance, but enough to ripple through the room like a second wave, sharper than the first, because now it was not just an object, it was a sequence, an arrival with intention, and someone near the back said, "Who is that for?" the question hanging in the air without direction, without answer, but full of implication. Because in a room built on comparison and perception, nothing like this arrived without belonging to someone. And that realization began to move through the crowd, subtle at first but gaining shape, as eyes shifted not just toward the window but back into the room, scanning faces, measuring possibilities, recalculating everything they thought they understood about each other. And Daniel felt it too. That shift, that quiet redirection of attention. And for the first time he looked at Olivia not as a memory or a mistake, but as an unknown variable, something he had not fully accounted for. Something that did not fit the narrative he had just presented, and the distance between them, only a few feet, suddenly felt wider than the years that had passed, because control was no longer his by default. It had become something unstable, something moving, and Olivia finally set her untouched glass down on the nearest table with a soft, deliberate motion, a small action that drew more attention than any words could have, not because it was dramatic, but because it was timed perfectly. As if marking the end of one version of the evening and the beginning of another, and without rushing, without seeking permission or acknowledgement, she shifted her weight slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on the past standing in front of her, but on what had just arrived beyond the glass, something that had not come to interrupt, but to reveal. The room did not move all at once. It shifted in fragments, small clusters of people leaning closer to the glass, voices lowered into speculation, while others stayed rooted in place, caught between curiosity and hesitation. And through it all, Olivia Bennet took her first step forward, not toward the center of attention, not toward Daniel Brooks, but toward the direction everyone else was now watching, her pace unhurried, measured, as if she had walked this path before in her mind, and the subtle sound of her heels against the polished floor seemed louder now, not because of volume, but because of timing. Each step landing in the silence that had replaced the earlier laughter, and someone turned to look at her again, then another, until attention began to divide between the aircraft outside and the woman moving calmly inside, as if the two were no longer separate events but part of the same unfolding moment. And Daniel noticed it too, the way the room was no longer anchored to him, the way Olivia's movement carried a kind of gravity he could not interrupt, and for a second, he considered saying something, reclaiming the space with another comment, another joke, but the words did not come the same way they had before, because certainty had left him, replaced by something quieter, less defined. And near the glass the aircraft door fully opened now, a clean, precise motion, followed by the appearance of a figure stepping into view, composed, deliberate, dressed with the kind of simplicity that suggested not effort, but position. And a few people near the front exchanged glances, recognition not yet formed but building, because there was something familiar in the posture, in the way he carried himself, not seeking attention, but commanding it anyway. And Olivia reached the edge of the room just as the figure began to walk across the short distance toward the entrance, the two trajectories aligning without hesitation, without pause, as if coordinated beyond the awareness of everyone watching. And the doors of the venue opened a moment later, letting in a breath of cool night air along with the final confirmation that this was not coincidence, not spectacle for its own sake, but arrival with purpose. And the man stepped inside, his gaze moving briefly across the room before settling exactly where it needed to be, on Olivia, not with surprise, not with urgency, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if this meeting had already been decided long before tonight. And without raising his voice, without drawing unnecessary attention, he stopped just within reach of her and inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if the entire room had not already been watching. And when he spoke, his tone was calm, precise, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest. "Miss Bennet," he said, the formality deliberate, unmistakable, and in that single address something shifted again, deeper this time. Because names carried weight, and the way he said hers did not match the version Daniel had just tried to define. It carried recognition, respect, alignment, and for the first time that night, Olivia allowed the smallest hint of a smile to surface, not wide, not triumphant, but certain, as if everything that needed to be said had already been understood without a single explanation. The name lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because of how it was said, steady, precise, undeniable, and the effect rippled outward through the room as people began to connect pieces that had not made sense moments ago. The aircraft, the timing, the composure, all of it aligning into something far more deliberate than coincidence. And Olivia Bennet did not rush to fill the silence. She did not turn to the crowd or explain. She simply met the man's gaze with the same calm recognition, as if they were continuing a conversation that had started long before anyone else was invited to witness it. While behind her, Daniel Brooks stood still, the distance between them now more than physical. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation, trying to understand not just what was happening, but how much of it he had completely missed. And a voice from the side, quiet but sharp with curiosity, finally asked what others were thinking. "Who is he?" And the answer did not come from Olivia. It came from the subtle shift in posture around the room, from the way a few faces changed as recognition clicked into place, because the man standing beside her was not unfamiliar to everyone, not in the circles that mattered. And without raising his voice, without announcing himself, he reached out just enough to rest his hand lightly at the small of Olivia's back, not possessive, not performative, but assured, the kind of gesture that spoke of partnership rather than display. And then he turned slightly toward the nearest group, his tone even, composed. "We have a departure window to meet," he said, not asking, not explaining, simply stating what came next. And in that moment the dynamic of the entire room shifted again, deeper than before, because this was no longer about a dramatic entrance. It was about priority, about time, about a schedule that did not adjust itself to the opinions of others. And Daniel took a step forward, without fully realizing it, drawn by something he could not quite control. "Olivia," he said, her name sounding different now, less certain, less defined, and she paused, not turning immediately, not giving him the instant response he had always expected in the past. And when she finally did look back, it was not the look he remembered. There was no trace of the woman who had once waited for his approval, no echo of the version he had dismissed. There was only clarity, quiet and complete. And for a brief second the room held that gaze, the past and the present suspended in the same space. And then Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "Since when?" The question unfinished, unnecessary, because what he was really asking could not be answered in a single moment. And Olivia did not explain. She did not list achievements or defend the path she had taken. She simply held his gaze for that fraction of time before letting it go, as if releasing something that no longer belonged to her. And the man beside her did not interrupt, did not rush. He simply waited, confident in the direction they were already moving. Because this was never about proving anything to the room. It was about leaving it behind. And as Olivia turned back toward the exit, the quiet understanding settled into place for everyone watching, that whatever they thought they knew about her had already expired. And what stood in front of them now was not a comeback, not a reaction, but a position she had built without them noticing. Daniel did not move when she turned away, but the room seemed to move around him, people shifting their weight, their attention, their assumptions, as if the version of the night he had been controlling had quietly dissolved and reassembled into something else entirely. And Olivia Bennet walked forward with the same steady pace, not hurried, not hesitant, the man beside her matching her step without needing to lead, because whatever existed between them was not about direction, it was about alignment. And as they approached the open doors, the night air carried a sharper clarity. The sound of the aircraft now a constant presence behind them, no longer dramatic, no longer surprising. Just real, just waiting, and a voice from somewhere behind broke through the silence, more urgent this time. "Olivia, wait." And it was Daniel again, not loud, but no longer controlled, the kind of call that came too late to change anything but still needed to be said. And she paused, not out of obligation, but out of closure, a brief stillness at the threshold between what had been and what was already moving forward. And without turning fully, she angled her head just enough to acknowledge the sound, giving him something he had not earned, but something she no longer needed to withhold. And he stepped closer, stopping just short of where she stood, the distance now defined not by space but by everything that had changed. "You could have told me," he said, the words uneven, searching for ground that no longer existed. And Olivia let the silence settle for a moment before responding. her voice calm, clear, carrying only as far as it needed to. You stopped listening a long time ago, and there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just a statement that closed a door without force. And Daniel held her gaze as if trying to find something familiar inside it, something he could recognize. But there was nothing left that belonged to him. And behind her the man waited, not impatient, not distant, simply present, his attention on her rather than the room, because this moment, small as it seemed, mattered more than any impression left behind. And Olivia turned fully then, not back toward the past, but forward, stepping out into the night where the light from the aircraft reflected softly against the ground, illuminating a path that had nothing to do with where she had started. And as they moved together, the subtle details became clearer, the precision of the operation, the coordination, the kind of execution that did not happen by chance. And someone inside whispered again, connecting the final pieces, because this was not just access, not just association, it was ownership, structure, control, and the realization spread in a quiet wave that did not need to be spoken aloud. While Daniel remained at the doorway, watching as the distance grew, not dramatically, not quickly, but steadily, each step placing her further beyond the version of her he once understood, and for a moment it seemed like he might say something else, something that could reach across that space. But the words never formed, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reclaim, and Olivia did not look back again, not because she was trying to prove a point, but because there was no reason to. The past had already released her, and ahead the aircraft waited with its door open, not as an escape, but as a continuation. And as she stepped closer, the light catching the edges of her silhouette, it became clear to everyone still watching that this was never about returning to be seen. It was about leaving without needing to be. The distance between the aircraft and the building was not far, maybe a few dozen yards across smooth pavement, but with each step Olivia Bennett took, it felt like crossing something far greater, something invisible yet undeniable. And the sound of the engines softened into a steady hum, no longer commanding attention but holding it, like a quiet reminder that this moment was not temporary. It was anchored in something real, something structured. And the man beside her remained just half a step behind, not leading, not following, but aligned in a way that did not need to be explained. And as they approached the base of the stairs, a member of the crew stepped aside with a respectful nod, not exaggerated, not performative, simply acknowledging her presence as expected, as if this was routine, as if she belonged here long before tonight. And Olivia paused for a brief second, not out of hesitation, but awareness, the kind that comes when a chapter fully closes without resistance. And for the first time since she stepped out of the building, she allowed herself to take in the silence around her, the absence of voices, the absence of judgment, the absence of everything that had tried to define her inside that room. And it felt lighter, not because she had proven anything, but because she no longer carried the need to. And behind her, through the glass, the figures remained, smaller now, indistinct, their reactions no longer reaching her, their opinions no longer shaping anything that mattered. And Daniel Brooks stood among them, still, watching, not with anger, not even with regret that could be easily named, but with the quiet realization that the version of her he had dismissed no longer existed anywhere he could reach, and that what stood before him now was not a result of his absence, but of her decision to move beyond it. And Olivia turned slightly, not enough to return, not enough to reopen anything, just enough to allow one final glance to pass over the space she had left behind. And there was no bitterness in it, no satisfaction either, just clarity, the kind that settles when something is fully understood and no longer questioned. And then she stepped forward, placing her foot on the first step, the motion simple, unhurried, final. And as she ascended, the light from the cabin fell across her, soft but precise, outlining not who she used to be, but who she had chosen to become. And the man followed without a word, the door waiting open above them, not as an escape, not as a statement, but as a continuation of a life built quietly, intentionally, beyond the reach of rooms like that. And just before she disappeared inside, Olivia paused for the smallest fraction of a second, not looking back, not acknowledging the audience that no longer mattered, but grounding herself in the moment. And then she stepped in, the door closing behind her with a clean, measured sound that carried further than any applause ever could. And as the aircraft prepared to depart, the truth settled fully into place, not spoken, not announced, but understood by anyone who had witnessed it, that she did not return to be accepted. She returned to show that she had already moved beyond the need to be.